Hello, welcome to a new episode of podcasts on fiction and the fantastic in the series Close Readings, produced by the London Review of Books. I am Marina, a writer who's often explored myths and fairy tales, and I'm very happy to be joined again by the novelist and critic Adam Thirlwell, a daring explorer of all things fictive, including the fantastic. We have both contributed to the LRB for a long while, though I can claim priority as I started earlier, being just that little bit older. In this episode, we are exploring two novels in which the devil plays a decisive role. The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner by James Hogg, which was first published in 1824, and The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, which has had a very bumpy history indeed of publication, but was written between 1928 and 1940 and really only reached readers in the 1960s. They are both ferocious, scathing, dazzling performances of comic horror, and they reflect on the nature of evil and extend our podcast series inquiry into the fantastic. These two writers will now take us onto metaphysical and highly charged territory, where religion and politics combust. Adam, to begin with, what kind of a novel is The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner?
Well, it's an incredibly strange novel, and I guess one of the first things to say about it is it was published anonymously, and that Hogg went to quite significant lengths to make sure that that anonymity was preserved at the moment of publication, because by then he was a very well-known writer. And the reason for that anonymity is that he wants to set up a kind of array of devices to try and assure the reader that what they're reading is absolutely true. So it begins with an editor's commentary about a sinner's life, basically giving the kind of objective or so-called objective facts about this sinner's life.
Almost forensic, almost legal.
Almost legal document. Then we get the sinner's version of his life in his own words. And that is then followed by a quite extraordinary postscript, again in this persona of the editor, where it becomes also kind of strangely metafictional because this editor describes that he basically first came across this story because of an article by Hogg in Blackwood's magazine, which was a very influential magazine published out of Edinburgh in the 1820s. And then goes in search, and this article is about the grave of a suicide that has been exhumed in the Scottish countryside. And this editor goes in search of this grave, and in his search comes across Hogg. And Hogg had his own double life because he began his life and in fact continued not only as a writer, but he was a shepherd. He was a working class person who earned his living as a shepherd, known as the Ettrick shepherd. He was born in Ettrick and lived always very close to Ettrick. This fictive Hogg refuses to come and help him. He's much more interested in a sheep auction that he's currently at. And so the editor continues, gathers a couple of other Edinburgh intellectuals in this pursuit. And so the novel ends on this incredibly ghoulish image that they again dig up this already sort of twice dug up corpse, and they find a manuscript. And so it's tightly rolled up and has been miraculously conserved for over 100 years in this peat bog. And that manuscript is the sinner's narrative that we have been reading. So it's a novel published in 1824, but actually taking place over 100 years earlier. So it's, in a way, it's a historical novel at the same time.
I mean, he was quite successful in persuading people that he hadn't written it because people went on ascribing it to other people afterwards.
And I think that here it's kind of fascinating partly in how his reputation had developed. So it was ascribed to other people in part because people couldn't believe that the Ettrick shepherd had written such a sophisticated, I think, in a slightly arrogant way, would like to say a kind of postmodern way. So it's so playful and intelligent and kind of artfully constructed that some people just didn't believe Hogg could do that.
Also very philosophical and metaphysical about religion, about history.
And with a huge amount of kind of theological learning, very artfully kind of deployed within it.
I mean, the dualism goes really deeper than that. I mean, it's very much a theme of the novel, but it's also his dualism between being a shepherd and a man of intellectual who's part of Blackwood's magazine editorial team. I mean, he was deeply divided. Also, it's about borders and highlands, about England and Scotland. I mean, there are many ways in which the doubling runs all the way through and then is refracted into the plot, which is about a form of possession, a form of doubling. The good brother is called George Cowan, and the evil brother, who might be his full brother, or might be his half-brother, and is the justified sinner, is called Robert Wringhim, Wringhim after the person who isn't admitted to be his father, but probably is his father. The evil, hypocritical divine.
It's incredibly kind of vaguely and deliberately vaguely kind of said whether they're half-brothers or brothers. An initial joke, basically, that the real father of the first son is this bonhommous laird of Dalcastle, who is, as it were, irreligious, who's just someone who enjoys his wine and women, as it were.
Dancing and
drinking. And his wealth, and has mistakenly married a very dour Presbyterian woman who holds very tightly to her Christian principles. And really the man in her life is her parson, is this man also called Robert Wringhim. And the initial editor's narrative is actually very vague as to how, because it's quite clearly stated that she has refused to allow her husband to her bed.
The laird of Dalcastle.
How she has managed to produce 2 children. But you gradually realise that the first son is indeed the laird's, and the second son is actually hypocritically the son of this
this extraordinary Tartuffe-like figure, this
Exactly.
amazing religious hypocrite.
And the religion.
And his name, Wringhim, is of course, extraordinary. It refers to the sort of Puritan extremity of his kind of repression. Wringhim.
I think it's wonderful because it's both this kind of idea of just squeezing everything out of yourself, like refusing the human inside yourself. And it has this kind of weird execution-y kind of vibe about it as well, that, that behind this, what is the idea of someone having their neck wrung? And the theology that Wringhim espouses is a particularly insane version of a kind of Calvinist theology, which believes not only in predestination, but also in justification purely by faith. And that the idea that no good works are of any importance on the scale of your salvation.
Because we're irredeemably fallen. Because there is absolutely no redemption except
through
in God's mercy.
Exactly.
And that's intermittent and partial.
Yeah.
He will only grant, there are only 1 or 2 justified sinners.
Exactly. But both Wringhims, in their arrogance, believe that they are justified and that therefore they can do no wrong. And so it becomes almost this Dostoevskian thought experiment where as soon as you believe that you can do no wrong because you are ineluctably one of the elect, you can completely disobey all of God's commandments. And most importantly, you can therefore have no need, for instance, not to kill. And so there's this amazing passage that maybe we should read where the young Wringhim in his memoirs describes how his father comes to him one day and says, I have had a message from God. You are one of the elect. You are justified. And within a paragraph break, he then meets this crucial extra double, that we've got the doubles who are brothers, and then there's this other double who he encounters on the road.
It's called antinomianism, this idea that you can do no wrong if you've been chosen, because we all do wrong anyway, we're all sinners. But you can sin to extremity if you're justified. Yeah,
there's a wonderful line I love, even long before we really get to the true horror, where Lady Dalcastle says, how delightful to think that a justified person can do no wrong. And that's basically the joke.
The interesting thing is that this means actually that evil, the devil, becomes the actual familiar of the justified sinner. And this is why the book was scandalous and created difficulties for Hogg, is because he was actually pretty much indicting what became the Wee Free Church, the Wee Free Kirk, with being on the side of the devil.
It seems an absolute kind of refusal of almost a Protestant kind of mentality. But really, I suppose it's this idea of the fanatic as well. So this word fanaticism comes back often. And I think it's one of the interesting things to discuss is how the novel, which was developed almost as this very liberal form, what it does when it tries to depict a fanatic. Because in one sense, the fanatic is the enemy of the novel, and how the novel tries to, not just this novel, but any novel, I think, tries to depict a fanatic is very difficult for it.
Well, I think that's to do with the role of the fantastic, to try and actually aim its criticisms at certain aspects of the society around it by exaggeration and, by extreme lineaments of grotesquerie.
And pushing something to the extreme, I think. So here is Wringhim describing the day when he is assured of his sanctification. I wept for joy to be thus assured of my freedom from all sin, and of the impossibility of my ever again falling away from my new state. I bounded away into the fields and the woods to pour out my spirit in prayer before the Almighty for his kindness to me. My whole frame seemed to be renewed. Every nerve was buoyant with new life. I felt as if I could have flown in the air or leapt over the tops of the trees. An exaltation of spirit lifted me, as it were, far above the earth and the sinful creatures crawling on its surface. And I deemed myself as an eagle among the children of men, soaring on high and looking down with pity and contempt on the grovelling creatures below. As I thus wended my way, I beheld a young man of a mysterious appearance coming towards me. I tried to shun him, being bent on my own contemplations, but he cast himself in my way so that I could not well avoid him. And more than that, I felt a sort of invisible power that drew me towards him, something like the force of enchantment, which I could not resist.
This is Gilmartin. He's really a figure of the shadow double, the devil who haunts you.
And it is quite literally the devil, we discover gradually. And that Gilmartin is kind of folk name for a fox as well, so that there's this link to the sly and the cunning and almost a trickster figure, but who has this also fascinating ability to basically take on the appearance of absolutely anybody he contemplates.
This shifts him from an actual real person, an actual character. He is both in the novel. He's an actual character, a real independent being, but he's also, in some ways, the imitation of people, their reflection in the glass, their hallucination.
Another reason why I think this work seems so modern, and why, as it were, it was writers like André Gide who actually made this novel kind of popular again, because it had actually been neglected for about 100 years after it was published, is that this novel interrogates what it is to be a person, so that as well as it being this novel with a very precise theological target, it widens out to basically how anyone can know themselves or another person, I think. And it's interesting, Carl Miller, in his book on Hogg, since we're here in the LRB, he wrote this extraordinary book called Electric Shepherd, and he points out that the devil and Hogg himself use very similar language about themselves. So the devil says that if I contemplate a man's features seriously, mine own gradually assume the very same appearance and character. And actually, 15 years earlier, Hogg, he'd had a magazine called Mr. Spy, which was a short-lived magazine. And in the persona of Mr. Spy, Hogg describes what he calls his abominable propensity. By contemplating a person's features minutely, modelling my own after the same manner as nearly as possible, and putting my body in the same posture which seems most familiar to them, I can ascertain the compass of their minds and thoughts. So there's a very interesting setup between the work of the writer, who is trying to imagine the lives of others, and what the devil can do as well.
I mean, this is part of the romantic movement towards interiority.
Yeah.
This whole spiritual world, the whole spectacular world of ghosts and spirits, and the religious structure has actually become part of the psychology of the ordinary person as well as the disturbed person. So there's that in Hogg too, that belongs to that period of the late 18th century, early 19th century. But at the same time, he's also part of the modern world, and maybe that's what the Electric Shepherd refers to, because when one of the really torrid encounters with his menacing brother takes place on the top of Arthur's seat, and actually takes the form of a spectral projection, which is known as the Brocken spectre, but is a meteorological fact. And so there's a natural description, if you like, a scientific natural description. And Hogg was interested in that and took part in, David Brewster, who was the inventor of the kaleidoscope and the stereoscope, I think, or maybe both, was one of his friends. It was part of the Scottish Enlightenment to be interested in the technology. And this amazing climactic moment in the book.
Hogg was also part of the scientific discovery of what's called the calotype, which is the photography where objects are kind of the sort of thing that modernist photographers like Moreau were then using 100 years later.
Yeah, so these extreme experiences that he had are actually explained in many, many different ways. I mean, it's one of the things that a novel can do. A novel of the fantastic can do is offer many different explanations for states of mind, for certain experiences. As he approached the swire at the head of the dell, that little delightful verge from which in one moment the eastern limits and shores of Lothian arise on the view, as he approached it, I say, and a little space from the height, he beheld, to his astonishment, a bright halo in the cloud of haze that rose in a semicircle over his head like a pale rainbow. And then, later, Adam, over to you.
Gracious heaven, what an apparition was there presented to his view. He saw delineated in the cloud the shoulders, arms, and features of a human being of the most dreadful aspect. The face was the face of his brother, but dilated to 20 times the natural size. Its dark eyes gleamed on him through the mist, while every furrow of its hideous brow frowned deep as the ravines on the brow of the hill. George started, and his hair stood up in bristles as he gazed on this horrible monster. He saw every feature and every line of the face distinctly as it gazed on him with an intensity that was hardly brookable. Its eyes were fixed on him in the same manner as those of some carnivorous animal fixed on its prey, and yet there was fear and trembling in these unearthly features, as plainly depicted as murderous malice. The giant apparition seemed sometimes to be cowering down as in terror, so that nothing but its brow and eyes were seen. Still, these never turned one moment from their object. Again it rose imperceptibly up and began to approach with great caution, and as it neared, the dimensions of its form lessened, still continuing, however, far above the natural size.
This is quite Coleridgean, this idea that supernatural experiences might have a scientific explanation, but that doesn't dilute or diminish their horrible power. They remain extremely frightening. And actually, we should say that a lot of this novel is almost unbearable to read in terms of the pictures of violence, and the exhumation of the body at the end is really chilling.
Yeah, I think it's quite unusual almost even in that era for the ability to, the depiction, say, of the exhumation. There's an extraordinary moment where some of the detail is really macabre, like how this corpse is found sitting upright and can't be put down. And so there's an amazing moment where one of the people who've dug this body up has to stamp on the skull and crushes the nose down into the face. And it's an incredibly detailed image. There's also, in I think their first murder that Gilmartin and Wringhim perform on a seemingly highly innocent another pastor who is shot as he's walking in a field. And there's this extraordinary sentence where it's described that after he's shot, he's moving his hands on the floor like someone who has lost something, which is just such an amazing imaginative detail. So there's the physical at its extreme in this novel.
Where do you think the fantastic is going in the book? I mean, in terms of, he's taken a sort of old idea, hasn't he, a medieval idea, which we'll come across again in the Bulgakov we're going to do next, and which is of a pact with the devil, an actual agreement that, and this goes back to Mephistopheles and then is refracted through all these romantic plays like Goethe and Marlowe. In fact, he must have had Marlowe in mind, I think, Hogg.
Yeah, and it's interesting that both Marlowe and Goethe's Faust were fashionable at the time. So Blackwood's had just published essays and extracts from both Marlowe's Dr. Faustus and the translation of Goethe's Faust. So he would have known, even if not the whole of Goethe's Faust.
Why do you think Scotland was so particularly interested in these ghoulish tales? Because later we get Robert Louis Stevenson and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which owes a tremendous debt to Hogg's Private Memoirs.
It's true, and I don't know. I think with Hogg himself, clearly one part of it is simply his upbringing, that he was very close to the stories that he would have grown up with, which will have been folk tales and tales of spirits, of devils, of possession.
Changelings.
So
fetches.
Maybe it was just partly that he was more in touch with this material. And in a sense, I don't know how specifically Scottish it is, in the sense that De Quincey had just written his Opium Eater book only the year earlier, which actually Blackwood was fascinated by. And that is another book of kind of breakdown of the self, feeling that there are multitudes inside yourself.
It was a very strong theme at the time.
So it was a theme at the time. Yeah,
because Hans Christian Andersen wrote the Double, which is the Shadow, which is another story of tremendous doubling, terrifying doubling. It's around this time too.
You mentioned earlier, there are obviously personal reasons why Hogg was interested in the idea of the double, that he lived a double life in one sense. And also I think he was very exercised, clearly, and rightly so, by in-jokes in the magazine. So there was a kind of multiply authored, almost column, I guess we'd now say, in Blackwood's called Noctes Ambrosianae, where they invented personae for each other. And one of them was the shepherd. And this shepherd was partly how Hogg became kind of famous, that he was known as the Ettrick Shepherd, and this persona that became incredibly popular, but not written by him, but written by his so-called friends.
And it was a bit malicious.
It was entirely kind of, this mix of, I guess, they were, condescending kind of teasing. So he knew what it was to have a persona, as it were, foisted on you. I think that was another reason why he published this book anonymously, was because he was trying to avoid the vision, as it were, the idea of him that both the Edinburgh kind of literati had and the wider reading public.
He'd also provided for Scott the material, for the minstrelsy of the Scottish borders.
So he helped kind of collect
material.
material.
He helped compile that because he knew it.
Yeah.
In a way that possibly Scott himself didn't.
And so do you think, in trying to kind of answer this question of was there something specifically Scottish about this, that clearly one of the fascinating things about the novel is how specific it is both in its locale. So he's very happy to name places that really almost no one reading this book will know of, but actually he knew intimately, very small villages around where he grew up. But also the Scottish history of this book, he's quite oddly specific about dates in this book. And you gradually realize that what he's mapping it onto is the period from the Glorious Revolution of 1688 to just after the Act of Union of 1707, which was an incredibly febrile time in Scottish politics and in England as well. But in Scotland particularly, there were these divisions between Episcopalians, Presbyterians, between the kind of the Whig and the Tory, and between those who wished Scotland to stay independent and those who wanted to join with England. And so I think one reason why these myths of division and the divided self were kind of so useful or to think with at the time were because there were these divisions that were essentially unhealed.
And violence.
And even though this history was 100 years old, even in the 1820s, it was still very live.
There's also a linguistic division, isn't there?
Yeah, we were discussing how we would even read from this book because we both speak obviously with English voices, and there is a large amount of brilliantly rendered Scots in this book. And actually often the Scots speakers, who are almost all servants or they're working class characters, they often speak truth to power, as it were. They're often completely correct. So whereas the editor speaks in the language of, as in when the register of Blackwood's magazine, and the sinner speaks in this slightly more religiously inflected, but still kind of Oxbridge English, as it were.
But there's sort of King James Bible.
Yeah, it's saturated in phrases from the King James Bible. Whereas there are servants who speak in this often witty, down-to-earth, and almost always morally correct way. And actually there's a very long passage where one of Wringhim's servants, Samuel Scrape, tells a very long story, that goes over 3 or 4 pages in this not very long novel, telling essentially a story of diabolical possession. And at first, it was interesting, when I was rereading this, I was thinking, what is Hogg doing with this? Why are we suddenly stopping the narrative? And then you realize that it's because essentially what we've been reading is a folktale, a very ancient folktale of how easy it could be to be tempted by the devil. And it's a tale of possession. And then in sort of off-center of this novel is an original tale, as it were, something clearly that has come down from generation to generation.
I feel that the Private Memoirs hasn't quite become, it's an Oxford classic in publication, but hasn't quite attained the status of a classic. Do you feel that? And I thought the one reason might be that when I reread it, the first time I read it, I was absolutely bowled over. But I think it does depend a little on suspense. So when I reread it, the fact that I knew what was going to happen actually slightly diminished the lurid effect. Yeah,
it suffered, I think, because it was, for many different reasons, whether political or literary, neglected during the 19th century after its publication. And I think that Hogg's kind of brilliance in this novel was, he was trying to do something new. And I think that there's an interesting, it's not just for Hogg, there's a literary problem sometimes of writers who try to change the way they write, that he was moving away from the kind of ballads that had made him famous. And people simply wanted more ballads, and they didn't want incredibly erudite Gothic fiction from him. And, I mentioned that Gide was one of the people who kind of suddenly kind of gave it a new importance. And it is fascinating to think of Gide, this brilliant writer of morality, of Protestant morality and the flesh.
Absolutely.
I can absolutely see why this idea of the double. And
the rigorous, the rigors and depression and pessimism of Calvinism.
Exactly. There is an absolute link to something like Gide's novel, The Immoralist, or something like that. And I think it's something that we've been kind of touching on often, that there is a way in which the Gothic in general there are pejorative terms to be used about it, like, people will call it kitsch or schlocky or kind of that. And it's interesting how much it's often linked to B-movie kind of aesthetics. So I think he suffers from the genre in some way.
There are moments of black comedy, aren't there? Even in the midst of all this horror, that we find ourselves smiling and laughing.
There's the physical, the grotesque physical horror of things like we've mentioned, of these corpses. There's an amazing moment, as well as this corpse sort of sitting up, where Wringhim is desperately on the run, both from the law, because he's now killed so many people, and also from Satan, because he's trying to get away. And he ends up in a weaver's house, and the weaver locks him in the room where he has all of his loom. And Wringhim tries to get away, but basically describes, and it's quite hard to visualize initially, that he's getting more and more trapped in the warp and the weft.
Yes.
And until he's literally upside down, he's hanging, and it's like kind of the tarot card of the hanged man.
Yes.
There's something deeply symbolic, clearly, about it, that this is how a devil would be that you'd find him hanging upside down. But it is also incredibly funny. This sort of almost black comedy of a man trying to escape and ending up hanged from a loom in the middle of nowhere in the Scottish countryside.
It's been eclipsed, of course, by Stevenson's Tale of Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He simplified it so much. The sort of lineaments of the story become very streamlined in Stevenson. But he caught the main mood, the main terror.
What still fascinates me in the Hogg, and maybe does make it newly contemporary, I think, and I think it actually links very specifically to Bulgakov, is the way within a cult, as it were, and in one sense, all religions are cults, or they start as cults, and the way within a sect or a cult, the question of backsliding and veracity and how much you can trust your own intuitions that you are one of the chosen is both important within Calvinism and Bolshevism. And I think there's a very interesting link here that actually what makes this novel contemporary for me is poor Wringhim's kind of terror that he may have made a mistake. Like, what if he is not one of the elect? And the kind of conversations with Satan are actually very interesting, where Satan's main job is to assure him over and over that he is absolutely one of the elect, and that therefore he can do anything. And I think that anxiety as to, are you truly a member? Have you somehow misstepped or kind of made a mistake? Is something that you can then again very clearly recognize in the way in which it kind of links almost to the show trials of Stalinism, where you're having to interrogate yourself over and over as a communist or as a Calvinist as to how far you may have kind of somehow misunderstood or misinterpreted something.
Indeed, absolutely, because at one time he thinks that his demon, Gilmartin, is actually Peter the Great in disguise.
Yeah.
So there's a sort of sense there that deference towards the mighty and the powerful is being indicted by Hogg, because it's a form of self-deception.
And there are actually, and in terms of the comedy, some of the comedy is just pure hypocrisy. And there's something, if it weren't so horrifying and if we weren't reading a serial killer, it would be just genuinely funny to watch this incredibly priggish. Even in the passage we read when he meets Satan, he's soaring above these contemptible other humans. I love actually just how it's a paragraph break and then he's brought low. It's a paragraph break. He's at the height of his apparent powers. He then meets Satan and falls immediately.
We put it together with the Master and Margarita for this series, and because there are many, many convergences, and you've made the point about the show trials, that somehow fantastic encounters with the devil can actually become a lens through which to look at contemporary events in disguise. So The Master and Margarita is a rather different kind of novel, but it has this main theme that the devil visits the world.
Yeah, exactly. So it's got, both of them operate with this machinery of the fantastic, each in their very specific ways, with normalizing the fantastic, so that the way Hogg uses it is that Gilmartin can become anybody, so therefore Satan can just literally just take on any human form in some slightly blasphemous version of incarnation almost, that kind of this vast spirit can take on human form. Bulgakov does it in so many different ways, and I guess one thing to say before quite getting onto it is that obviously there is this other tradition that has develops sort of, we're kind of doing this tour of kind of Northern Europe, where very soon after Hogg, for instance, in St. Petersburg, Gogol writes amazing sequences, and the most relevant ones, I think, for Hogg being Diary of a Madman, where his hero, Proprishchin, I think it is, this is written in 1835, you gradually read this person's diary as they fall into madness. And then in 1846, Dostoevsky publishes The Double, which is very similar, about a man called Golyadkin, who already is kind of, before the story really begins, is talking to his psychiatrist, talking to his doctor about not feeling great. And the doctor tells him to get out more, and he goes to a party where essentially, as he leaves, he meets his much more charming double and gradually discovers that everyone prefers the charming Golyadkin. And so he then does genuinely go insane. And that idea of your life being taken over by the double is very similar, I think, to Hogg, even though, of course, I'm sure no one could have, I'm sure Dostoevsky could not have known of Hogg.
No, I mean, I think it's a convergence, which we might discuss, actually, the idea that fantastic leaps boundaries but doesn't need necessarily direct influence.
No, and also I think there's something interesting about that these are, in one sense, sort of peripheries to the metropolis, as it were, that if the history of the novel has come to be written as a sort of history of Paris and London, as it were, it's interesting that these novels are being produced in the kind of countryside outside Edinburgh, or in Russia, which was at the time very kind of disconnected from the rest of Europe.
Well, Bulgakov was also writing in a kind of internal exile.
Yeah.
His writing was not accepted.
So he was in a kind of double
rejected.
kind of isolation. Yeah. There's a little book I love by the Hungarian critic called Laszlo Foldányi, with this brilliant title, Dostoevsky Reads Hegel in Siberia and Bursts into Tears, which is one of the great titles. But he makes this fascinating point where basically that Hegel believed that world history, as it were, was very much a sort of metropolitan affair, that it was the centers of power were going to create it. And so Foldányi imagines Dostoevsky, who at the time had been sent to Siberia, reading this and then thinking, well, am I an outcast, therefore, from world history? Is it impossible? And Foldányi basically makes a kind of interesting argument that potentially it is the outcast from world history who actually created it. So it's an inversion of kind of Hegel. And there can be an argument of that, I think, for the novel as well, that the fantastic often operates outside.
On margins.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. If you're listening in Apple, you can do that just by going to the top of this podcast. Or for Spotify and other podcast apps, go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.